All right, now everybody's coming.
Thanks so much for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to focus on a lot of the work that I've been doing since coming to Cincinnati and thinking about how we can understand relationships between flow, habitat, and biology in urban streams. And as John alluded to, I spent a fair bit of time actually as a water manager in my career before coming to University of Cincinnati. I was a fisheries biologist and then an ecologist at a large groundwater district in Southern California, managing basically everything ecological from invasive species like quagga mussels and bullfrogs and crayfish to endangered species like steelhead. And so I sort of bring that particular perspective of thinking about how science can inform management into the work that I'm doing currently. And as I get started, I wanted to thank all the various folks that have helped out in the work that we've been doing here. A huge slew of undergraduate researchers, graduate students, Hamilton County Soil and Water Conservation District, and more particularly the Water Resources Center, which funded one of the projects that I'll be speaking about today. And why should we care about aquatic ecology in urban systems? Well, all these red dots are major cities throughout the United States. And hopefully what you can see in this figure is that we tend to build our cities adjacent to important bodies of water. And that particular aspect of building adjacent to water really matters for how we manage those systems. And one thing that you may or may not have thought about too much is, okay, so it's obvious that cities are on major bodies of water often, but what about the minor bodies of water? And there was a recent paper looking at headwater streams and how they're critical for sustaining fish, fisheries, and ecosystem services. And basically all these blue lines are tiny headwater streams throughout the United States. And we build our cities basically on this particular landscape. And urbanization can have dramatic impacts on these systems. And some of these are really obvious, right? The channelization of streams where walking through an urban setting, we may not even recognize that streams are present because they're fenced off, they're cemented in. But we also have made some of these aquatic systems as features of our city landscapes, building restaurants and areas to recreate adjacent to these systems. But all of the water that flows through these urban systems ends up in these rivers. So how has the urbanization syndrome modified the way aquatic systems work? Well, there was a paper a couple of years ago thinking about how ecosystem structure really is influenced by urbanization. And there's a couple of features that are really consistently found in urban streams. And one of the major ones is that hydrology is greatly modified by urbanization, where we see an increase in erosive and overland flows, increases in the magnitude of the big peak storms, and that storms cause the flows in streams to rise and fall much more rapidly than their natural counterparts. This then influences the channel itself, the morphology of the stream bed, increasing channel width, increasing depth, increasing scour, and this then has impacts on the biology that lives in these systems, where we see declines in sensitive species. So what happens as watersheds become urban? So this is from a paper looking at theoretical changes in hydrology in a watershed as the system becomes more covered in impervious surfaces. So the green line at the bottom that I'm showing is, say, 1960. And basically the features that you should see here is from the beginning of the storm at the zero axis, rain happens, flows gradually increase and then gradually decrease. The peak of the storm is rather spread out over time and it's rather low. But as the system becomes more urban, so here's now 2010, where the system is substantially urbanized, hopefully what you can see is now the storm flows rapidly rise after rainfall occurs. That peak is now a lot higher than it was under non-impervious surface conditions, and the storm now recedes much more quickly and actually ends up, the stream becomes much lower than it did under natural conditions. These changes in hydrology then influence the frequency of erosive flows. And this is a complicated figure that I'll try and walk through a little bit of the details, but this red dotted line is the 2-year storm event. And basically what we expect is as sediment size changes, so D50 is basically the particle diameter, so from sand to gravel to cobble to boulder, as our particles get bigger, it requires greater flows to actually move those particles. And we don't expect to see large particles like cobbles and boulders moved except for in these larger storms, these 2-year storm events. But when we change urban hydrology, we also change the frequency and the duration of those erosive flows. So this is looking at a watershed pre-development and post-development, and how long does the stream experience substantial discharge. The blue lines, hopefully you see that 25 hours of discharge exceeding the flows required to actually start moving sediment in that system, where post-development, you're now seeing several orders of magnitude, a lot more duration of time where the stream is moving sediment around. And so we need to consider this as we think about how to manage aquatic systems, and that stormwater management is really our link between hydrology and ecology. And as we think about the goals that we have for our aquatic systems, we need to consider how hydrology influences the hydraulics in the stream, the geomorphology of that stream, and then how that influences the organisms that live there. And this really makes us ask, well, what interventions, stormwater management, are feasible, scalable, and cost-effective? And probably the most obvious feature that you may have thought about in terms of water management is, we often think about restoring streams at large scales. But large-scale restoration is really costly. My PhD student, Chelsea Hintz, recently graduated and currently works at the US EPA here in Cincinnati. She did her PhD work looking at the removal of a large culvert in an urban stream here in Cincinnati. This project cost millions of dollars, and it really only impacted, a few hundred meters of stream. So not a large amount, but a large amount of cost. We can't obviously do this at the grand scale over the entire watershed, and the urban setting restricts any sort of large scale, sort of major changes in these streams. So what can we do, and how can we manage water in these systems? And one feature that we think about is habitat. Habitat in streams is a critical thing for the organisms that live there, but we also think about erosion. We don't want lots of sediment moving across the landscape and reducing water quality. I talked in a few slides ago about this critical flow where sediment starts moving. And one big question that we often have is we can estimate a theoretical discharge in which sediment starts moving. But these blue arrows that I'm showing here are really showing, well, how much do our theoretical estimates deviate from our actual measured estimates? Sometimes we're seeing flows much lower in some of these systems are mobilizing sediment more frequently. And so understanding the movement of habitat, particularly substrate, is really important for managing these systems. But another feature that you may not have thought too much about is wood. Wood is a critical component of most stream systems that have wood in their watersheds, but wood naturally moves in these systems. In natural systems, that may be beneficial, that you have sort of structures build and form, create habitat features, overhead cover, pools that organisms might use. But in an urban setting, that may be problematic. And in our lower right corner, you see wood clogging up a culvert. That may be a major impediment to the use of wood in urban streams because it might influence our infrastructure. And we often see in urban settings in the lower left-hand corner that wood becomes more mobile as streams become, or the watersheds that they're in, become more impervious, that some of this wood is moving all the time. So some of the questions we wanted to ask, and I'll be trying to address in this study, is can we develop scalable interventions like wood addition to influence habitat and sediment movement in urban streams? How does urbanization influence connectivity at the watershed scale? And how does fish movement respond to urban hydrology? And a lot of this work was funded by the Water Resources Center and supported my master's student, Peter Grapp. And we did this work in collaboration with Hamilton County Soil and Water and the US EPA and other collaborators at the University of Cincinnati. But first, I wanted to give you a little bit of motivation on why should water managers actually care about fish movement in urban streams. Well, in Ohio, we actually legally use fish as a component of understanding the health of our streams. And the fish community is used to determine impairment status. And we use this thing called the Index of Biotic Integrity, which incorporates the overall diversity of species, the trophic levels. So basically, are they predators? Are they herbivores? How much of the community is made up of tolerant species? And do you see obvious things that are being caused by maybe pollution, deformities, or evidence of energy? But this really assumes, I think it's a really good way of assuming impacts that have already occurred. But when we restore systems or we improve systems, it really assumes that the species can recolonize after some intervention has occurred. And as we think about connectivity, we also need to think about limitations to dispersal. Could we actually see a system improve its fish community if we did some modification in an upstream section? So here's a road crossing in the middle of Cincinnati. On the downstream side of this road crossing, we see 9 species. On the upstream side, we see 5 species. So just this barrier alone, even if we do all the mitigation in the world upstream, we're unlikely to see an improvement in the fish community on the upstream side of this. On the left side, we see a bunch of low-head dams. And we see IBI scores that range from orange and orange poor to purple good. And hopefully you can see that patches may be poor and the patches may be good, and they can be in relatively close proximity to each other. And so for fish to improve in these particular systems, we might need to see connectivity in those particular areas. One other element that we think about, and we're sort of some of our initial motivations in thinking about urban streams, is that there should be lots of pollution events that are occurring in urban systems. And in our stream, we thought, well, actually under high flow events that we expect to see pollution coming. And certainly pollution is entering the stream. This is a sanitary sewer during a storm event that you're seeing pouring mixed water, sanitary and stormwater back into the stream. But one thing that we were a little surprised about is that a lot of pollution actually also occurs during very low flows. And these may be even more impactful to the fish community because it's happening when there's really no dilution occurring. And over the course of our work, we saw at least 4 or 5 major pollution events in a small stream up near Blue Ash. The work that I'm going to be talking about has been done through the Cooper Creek Collaborative. And this was a partnership developed by my collaborator, Adam Lehman at Hamilton County Soil and Water, which brought together academics from UC and Ohio State, regional managers, as well as federal agencies with the goal of trying to develop and test management strategies to improve water quality in urban headwater streams. I've talked about how hydrology modifies habitat availability. Let's look at Cooper Creek itself. So here's a small headwater stream in Cincinnati. Immediately downstream of this site, a new impervious watershed pours into the stream. And immediately downstream of this, we see the channel basically double in width and become substantially simpler. We also know that hydrology modifies habitat availability in that we also see our streams have less water in them, often during the summer times. And some of this may be due to structural changes that modify base flow. So we've often built our infrastructure, like sewer lines, in the actual stream bed itself. And where these may collect water in leaking pipes, they also may deliver sanitary water back into the stream, but they also may change just the actual bed of the stream, and the gravel that surrounds those pipes might become a preferential flow path for water to move. So in this system, we see lots of dry sections of stream, but also exceptionally flashy flows. My colleague at Hamilton County was really interested in trying to develop mitigation strategies for managing stormwater. And he felt that starting at the upstream end, the headwaters, was most likely for us to be able to actually implement habitat projects that might not be impacted as greatly by major flow events. As we go downstream in the watershed, we're really not having any control over flow, and so it's going to be more problematic to see whether habitat's really eliminating or just the flows themselves. So he created this experimental watershed that is entirely sourced from two storm sewer areas, the pink and the blue. And at the downstream end of this is that fish barrier that I showed you, a road crossing at the downstream end. And within this watershed, we've been monitoring fish populations in 6 areas shown in light blue on this map. And looking at the fish community, at the very downstream site, we see a broad variety of different species, from darters to sunfish and bass to minnows and suckers. Just upstream of this road crossing, we already see our sunfishes drop out, and most of the darters also drop out. Go upstream a mile or less, and we basically now just have a very tolerant fish community made up entirely of minnows. So one question is, where do interventions make the most sense? Well, we may need to have an intervention to provide fish passage to the downstream side of this to ever see recovery in the fish community. We might need to have interventions on the upstream side for there to be habitat for fish to even come to. So one component that we've been thinking about is restoring habitat in urban streams to improve biological communities. An important component is trying to reduce some of the runoff, or at least the rate at which runoff occurs into these streams, but it's really best paired with some level of habitat restoration. Restoring this habitat allows fish communities potentially to recover from disturbances, and some of the features that are limiting in these streams are deep water habitat and the quality of those pools for fish to use. One way that people have done this in non-urban streams is adding woody debris. Is it a tool to restore habitat more broadly? It's broadly absent from urban streams in Ohio, but it's often in systems where there are lots of trees considered to be a primary driver of stream conditions by creating pool habitat, retaining fine sediment, and providing cover for aquatic organisms like macroinvertebrates and fish. And theoretically, wood is a scalable intervention. It doesn't necessarily require major engineering efforts, though it's often incorporated in major engineering restoration efforts. So our project that was funded by the Water Resources Center wanted to look at, do large woody debris installations actually work in an urban setting, in an urban headwater stream? And the first question is, will these wood additions actually remain stable? We predicted that bracing the jams against the riparian vegetation would be sufficient to stabilize that wood. And we hoped that by creating these wood jams, we might create more pool habitat, which is a feature that's pretty much missing in our study section of stream. We've predicted that they would increase overall depth and induce the formation of pools in our treatment reaches. Our experimental design was limited, and one of the challenges of working in urban systems is our experimental design is also limited by the amount of space we can actually work in. It required, I think, permission from maybe 10 landowners to be able to do this project, which was only over about a 500-meter section of stream. We established some before-after control impact reaches. 60-meter sections of stream where 2 of them were going to be treated, wood was going to be added, and 2 of them were just going to be monitored. We monitored for about 5 months before wood came into the stream, and then we monitored for over a year after the wood was added into the stream. So how did we actually monitor the stability of wood and the habitat that was being formed in the stream? So here's a theoretical section of stream. We set out a bunch of fixed cross sections, basically put fence posts out on the stream that we could go and repeatedly measure things at each site. In each of these sites, we surveyed these cross sections to be able to understand the overall shape of the channel and the composition of that channel. And then we were able to map those channel cross sections. And so we could look at these repeatedly over time to see how much erosion, how much pool formation is occurring in these particular areas. We were also interested in sort of connectivity along the stream channel and how long do are pools formed. So we created longitudinal fall wag profiles, and fall wag is basically just the deepest part of the stream channel. And we monitored the depth of the flow every meter over each entire section of stream. After the initial monitoring period, we installed a bunch of wood, and I'll talk a little bit more about that wood. And we tagged each piece of wood with something called a passive integrated transponder tag. If you have a pet that's been microchipped, they have one of these tags inside it. It allows us to have a unique identifier for each piece of wood that we can detect remotely, about a meter away, and be able to find wood that may have moved around and that might be otherwise difficult to actually figure out which piece of wood it was and where it came from. After the wood was installed, we came back, we resurveyed these cross sections. We resurveyed those fall wag depth profiles. And we also regularly tracked wood movement after storm events. And we both tracked the movement of the wood and also the way that wood was oriented in the stream to understand how much habitat is it actually generating. And I'm not an engineer, I'm not an expert in designing structures like this. So we recruited Bob Hawley from Sustainable Streams, who's done a lot of wood additions in streams, to help us design and install these wood. And he provided training to both my team, as well as I think it was about 25 community partners in the area, to understand how could we best install wood in these streams and how could they bring this to their own systems throughout the state. We installed 8 jams over about a 2-day period. Each of those jams was really sort of the size of the jam was sort of dictated by the particular location and the wood that was available on site. We had about 6 to 18 key pieces of wood in each wood jam, and they were braced against the riparian vegetation. There was no anchoring going on to really minimize overall disturbance of the site. Each of those pieces of wood, as I mentioned, all the large pieces of wood were individually tagged with passive integrated transponder tags. So our first question is, well, would the wood additions actually remain stable? We found that significant wood movement occurred on multiple occasions. In fact, right after we put in the wood, we had 2 of the largest storms during our entire study period occurred, and we saw about 20 to 30% of the wood rearranged itself into new jams during those first 2 storms. The highest flow events mobilized the wood jams, and I talked about these critical flows earlier in the talk, and these flows were about 12% greater than what a regional 2-year storm would be in an unimpaired system. But these occurred 5 times during 1 year. So you're seeing, again, that frequency of discharge being very high. And so what happened in the stream with this wood mobilization? So here's our 2 treatment reaches. We've colored each of the original wood jam installations. And now you can see we faded out the original jams and tried to keep the colors consistent. Hopefully you see some of the jams basically disappeared. Some of the jams basically recombined, so the red and blue turned into the purple jam. The yellow jam kind of got pushed to the side. The green jam got reduced in size, and a white jam formed. And then during some later storms, we saw, again, sort of mobilization of wood, changing the overall location and arrangement of the wood in the stream. We were successful in increasing the abundance of wood in the system. So from the left side of the graph, you see this dotted line with the wooded stall. And we're seeing now the number of pieces in each of our treatment reaches in orange. And hopefully you can see that during the first couple months, we see a substantial amount of wood is now in those streams or in those sections of the stream. About halfway through our monitoring period, you see some of the wood that is in treatment 1 moves downstream into treatment 2. It basically completely bypasses the control reach. There's nothing really to retain it there, and gets caught on the wood jams that are further downstream. These wood additions increased the habitat quality. There's something called the Large Woody Debris Index developed by Scott et al. In 2019. And basically, it sort of thinks about the complexity of a log jam. And they consider scores within this orange section to be functioning woody debris, that it's providing habitat, it's providing geomorphic impacts. And you're seeing, though we did see wood move around, that the wood quality in those sections of stream are much higher than in our control reaches. We also saw that the wood installations increased the wood quality. So you can see the control reach, there's some wood in the control reach, but it's not very complicated. It's simple, and not very much wood was retained. In our treatment reach, we see these complicated wood structures being retained. And the graph on the right is showing that this is a significant impact. The treatments before monitoring, we don't see complicated wood features there, and after, in our treatment sections, we see complicated wood and not in the control reaches. So did this actually do the work that we were hoping for? Did the large woody debris additions increase pool habitat availability? Well, the answer is yes and no. Some of the pools increased in size. So these are thalloid profiles. That orange or pinkish dotted line going through the center of the stream is basically what you're seeing drawn on these graphs, basically the topography of the stream channel. So the areas that are lower on the y-axis are showing you pool sections. And hopefully what you can see, we've color-coded those log jams in purple, yellow, green, white, and you see that there are pools downstream of those. And after the wood was installed, you see some of those pools increase in size. And some increase in wood made longer and deeper pools. Some of those pools expanded in size in these sections where the control didn't really change very much. And these impacts were significant. We did see a significant increase in the pool size in these sections where wood was added. So did large woody debris increase the availability of pools in this section? We saw changes in cross sections directly near the wood jams, but these areas weren't very much. You do see pre-treatment, you see a small pool forming, some increase in depth in this particular section. But I talked about the movement of wood earlier, and we found that the instability of this wood really changed that function. So this pool was formed, and then the wood moved, and then the pool filled back in again. So wrapping up this section on woody debris, we did see that wood can provide geomorphic function, but the stability of the wood in this urban stream is potentially limiting to its overall function as a generator of habitat. and that it doesn't generate it for all that long, given the frequency at which these storm events occurred. So the next piece that I wanted to talk about is how much do fish actually move in these urban headwater streams, and are movements actually tied to flow events? Similar to the wood movement that I was talking about, we used passive integrated transponders again to now track fish and fish movement. And you can see my student using a portable antenna. Basically, she's using it like a metal detector, scanning the entire stream bed and looking for tagged fish hiding in the stream. We also used a series of stationary antennas. You can think of these as gates, basically where the fish would swim by it and their ID tag would be recorded, and the time would be recorded as they swim by that particular area. This project was unfunded and was really a labor of love for a number of undergraduate students. Those in yellow ended up being co-authors on a recent publication that we got out of this project. And we initially tagged fish in the headwaters. Almost all of them got tagged in the largest pool in this reach, which is the headwater outlet, where the storm sewer enters the stream and becomes daylighted. A major section of this stream is typically dry, and that divides the upstream section of our study reach from the downstream section. So we're interested in understanding how do fish respond to flow. And we did this over this 500-meter section of stream at the headwaters, the same reaches that we ended up using later for our woody debris tracking. The stream starts from the storm sewer, and this is what a typical day at Cooper Creek looks like. Relatively low flows. This is really the only major pool habitat in the section. 15 minutes later, after a rainstorm event, this is what the channel now looks like. You've increased discharge about 10 times, and you've also increased the depth and velocity by a substantial amount. So we're interested, do fish actually get displaced by these high flow events? So we used stationary antennas in this channel to try and understand how our fish actually being displaced. We had some stationary antennas actually inside the storm sewer pipe. You can see those blue circles on the left are one right at the entrance and one about 10 meters upstream in the pipe. And then we had some at the downstream side after the trapezoidal channel transitions to natural sediment. And this is what it looks like on the downstream side. So we had more or less a section of stream that is very low flow and doesn't contain habitat for fish to actually stay during low flow periods. So what does it look like during a major storm event? So those black arrows on the left are pointing to the location of each of those antennas. Each of the colored lines is an individual fish and its movements between each of these antennas over the course of a storm. Hopefully what you can see is on the left side of the graph, fish are mostly hiding actually in that pipe itself. During the storm event, they're still up in that pipe, and the flows in the channel were on the order of 4 to 6 feet per second. So cranking flows inside the pipe itself, but the fish were still up there. As the storm receded, the fish actually started exploring and going down into the downstream sections, but all of these fish ended up coming back and hanging out in the pool after the storm had completely passed. We also looked over the 500-meter scale to see how much fish moved around over the course of about a year period. And tagged fish moved throughout the reach. Most of the fish really stayed in the upper section of stream, or at least they mostly were found in the upper section of stream, but many of them actually explored the downstream sections and then came back into the upstream sections. So let's look at a couple of individual movements. So each of these graphs is an individual fish. The dark blue line shows you flows over the course of this study period. And the little blue fish symbols show you the location of a fish from the upstream side at 0 to the downstream side at basically the road crossing at Plainfield Road. What you see on the upper left figure is that fish basically always stayed in the upper pool in the channel. The fish just to the right of that made an exploratory movement all the way to the very bottom of the reach, potentially left the reach entirely, came back, went all the way back up to the top, and came back downstream again. Some of these movements occurred during major storm events, and some of these movements occurred during lower flow events. But we also had a really interesting experience, and there's a couple of fish that their symbol shows up in red. And these are fish that showed up where the industrial channel enters the stream about halfway down. So there's a small sewer shed that basically drains an industrial complex. It's mostly impervious surface cover. And we didn't realize until most of the way through our study that it turns out they have a retention basin for containment of some, I don't know, oil or gas or something up there, that every once in a while they have to drain the water that builds up from rain in there, and they drain it just at random intervals. And it ends up being a substantial amount of water for half an hour to an hour that enters the stream. And we only saw it once or twice over the course of the period, but it turns out it happens very regularly, more or less after every storm event. And so here is basically flows during a period of no rain, where on the right, you're seeing a video of the flows filling up the stream in the section downstream of where this impervious industrial sewer shed comes in. And it turns out that fish make use of these small, short flow events and move around. And so here are two fish that we observed entering this industrial outfall, that they were most likely actually downstream of the channel entirely, because we hadn't not found them for several weeks. And then during the industrial discharge event, we find them in the very pool outlet of that industrial discharge. The fish were likely downstream and then moved up from outside of our study reach into that pool. One of them ended up going all the way back upstream eventually, and the other one ended up dying in that pool. Over the course of our study, we saw many of the fish crossed the dry section of the stream. Obviously, they were only doing this during storm events, but many of the fish actually, about 50% of the fish over the course of our study, ended up exploring some other section of stream and then coming back usually to the upstream section of stream. Fish moved more during storm events. So the upper graph is showing you discharge, and we've categorized sections of the month based on how large of flow events occurred during the period between when we looked for the location of the fish and the next time we looked for the location of the fish. And on our bottom graph, you see the overall movement that we observed of all the fish that were still in the reach. The ones with red stars are ones that are significantly greater than 0, that the average movement in the stream was larger. And the probability of moving was higher during moderate and major storm events, which isn't terribly surprising, that the fish are keying into these storm events and being able to actually move around. And in a section of stream that has a major dry section, these moderate and major flow events are likely to be important for fish to actually move. But similar to the data that I showed you earlier of fish during a storm event, storms didn't actually seem to generate directional movements. So if flows were so high that the fish were getting displaced, you'd expect to see net negative movement. So on our lower graph, signed movement, negative movements are downstream movements. And we really only see a couple of events where you do see some level of negative movement, but on average, those aren't actually different than 0. And some fish were moving upstream during those same periods. So we're not seeing lots of evidence that the storms are washing the fish away, but rather that they seem to be exploring during storm events and moving around. We also found that fish survival and creek chub are remarkably resilient fish. I actually have one in an aquarium here. It jumped out of its tank, was on the floor for 10 or 15 minutes, put it back in the tank. It's still alive several weeks later. That should give you even more of a context that fish survival in this urban stream was quite low. Over the course of about a year, we saw basically all of the fish in our system die. And some of this was punctuated by high mortality events. And those high mortality events seemed to mostly be coinciding with low flow pollution events. The picture on the right was a paint dump from a body shop upstream in this channel, but we also had sanitary infalls, potentially by someone dumping a poop truck into the stream. And so hopefully this talk has given you a little bit of context for how we might think about fish in the context of urban streams, how we might think about habitat in the context of urban streams, and how our interventions are going to be really dependent on what success do we see is going to really be dictated by fish passage. That if fish can move after an intervention occurs, we may be able to see a recovery in this IBI score that we've thought about. But where we need to both modify habitat and improve habitat, we also potentially need to modify connectivity in these channels and potentially understand how much connectivity is there and how do different species how do different species actually respond. So we used in our movement study a very tolerant, common headwater specialist species, but what about things like the darters, which tends to be much more sensitive to the impacts of urbanization? So I wanted to wrap up by thinking about the management implications of our work. The wood additions did seem to have the potential to increase pool habitat availability, but some of this was really limited by the stability of those wood installations. My colleague, Bob Hawley, who helped us install this wood, has not seen quite this dramatic level of movement in some of the other sites in urban sites where he has added wood. And potentially some of the problems here are that the natural bracing that we had, which was primarily the riparian corridor in Cincinnati, is mostly dictated by invasive honeysuckle. Honeysuckle has very shallow roots. When you brace the wood against that high flows, it tends to just wash that honeysuckle away. So there may be some requirement for some level of artificial anchoring to increase wood stability. But it also calls for the need for flow remediation. So something to keep the flows from occurring at these two-year storms, which are occurring 5 times a year. We need to reduce the frequency of those high flow events. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Hey, thanks, Mike. Yeah, does anybody out there have any questions? We have some time. I have a couple, then if nobody is going to volunteer. So the results that you showed for the fish movement, that's is there comparable data for natural streams for comparison to understand mobility under a natural environment?
Yeah, so there've been a handful of other studies with creek chub. Creek chubber is this sort of broadly very resilient species that's found sort of throughout most of Eastern North America. We do see, like, the mortality rates that we're seeing are very high, even relative to other systems. The movement rates, I would say, are comparable to those of other systems. There was some work done in Arkansas in a naturally intermittent stream, and they did see large-scale movements of creek chub in these systems. We're not seeing other species like darters, suckers, really moving beyond many of the barriers where the creek chub do seem to be able to move past some of the barriers in these systems. Because we didn't have funding for that particular project, we sort of took the low-hanging fruit species that were accessible and abundant in the system, but we're very curious to see sort of at the broader scale how are movements sort of influencing what's going on in these systems, and hoping to do some population genetics work to understand sort of the Mill Creek watershed as a whole, and how much does that sort of match up with the context of other adjacent streams.
Okay, so to some extent, you addressed the other question I was going to ask, which was related to the fish you were actually monitoring. So the one that you selected, you said it was a chub of some sort?
Yeah, creek chub.
Creek chub. So that fish has tendencies to be more mobile than some of the other fish that you had mentioned. So that was kind of where I was going to go with my second
creek
question.
chub are thought to be relatively mobile, though again, like some of the individuals, like we always found them in the same pool. They didn't get displaced by storms. We thought they might. 6 to 8 feet per second is cranking. That's a lot of velocity to be withstanding, and they seemed to be able to handle it just fine.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions?
Hi, I have a question. First off, thank you very much for your presentation and sharing all your findings from this work. My question is about the detectors that you use for the log jams. I think that's pretty interesting to try to track how the wood is moving. Did you lose any of those? And any other findings from, or takeaways, I guess, from using those? And then my other question is, do you have any recommendations based on small and large streams of placement of woody debris? You talked a lot about maybe using anchoring. Do you have like a cutoff of stream size or anything like that where you found it to be more necessary?
Okay, so question one, the pit tags are amazingly resilient, and they are very useful in that they reduce a lot of your search time, because so let me pull up. So each of these logs in this picture, you can probably see maybe a little patch of paint somewhere on them. That's where those colors from those log jams came in. So that would give us a broad sense of where the tag was put. But our pit tag reader, which is our pit tag reader, that blue hoop there, it can read a tag from about 1 meter away. So you don't have to be all that close to be able to find the log, and it basically, it's kind of like a metal detector. It actually beeps more close together, more loudly as you get closer to the tag itself. We can also use a different pit tag reader that reduces its range, so we could actually really accurately pinpoint it. I didn't talk about, because of time limitations, we actually tagged a bunch of rocks in the stream as well to see how individual rocks moved, to really see, are we influencing the rate at which sediment is moving in the system? And we were able to relocate individual rocks, even buried in the sediment, to like less than a foot. And so that's a really powerful aspect of this, that each log has an individual indicator. We could see where it goes. You don't have to try and figure out, you could go downstream and find a log pretty quickly. I'd say the biggest downside of the pit tags in logs is that many of the logs here rot fairly quickly. And so that's where you potentially may see, a couple years from now, if the log breaks apart, you only the piece that still has a pit tag in it is going to be detected. On your second question about installing wood. So this is definitely a question that we do not have a great answer for. And there's also sort of a social aspect to wood and wood installations. So in the lower corner of this particular picture, you see, or maybe you may not be able to tell, but it is a former like tractor bridge. It's got a couple of pieces of metal across the stream that a landowner probably 50 years ago would use to bring the tractor from one side of the creek to the other side of the creek. That ended up being the major retentive structure in the stream. Much of the wood ended up getting caught on that. In the context of this particular study, that was fine. The landowners didn't care. Actually, the landowners adjacent didn't even know it was there anymore, though the property's been in their family for that entire time. But that was a major concern. We never saw wood getting clogged up on the culvert itself on the downstream side of this reach, the road crossing. But if the landowners had very much cared about this tractor bridge, we probably would have had to pull the wood out. And so that would have potentially been a problem. I will say my colleague, Bob Hawley, has done this in another stream. I don't remember what its name is, but a similar sized stream in the Cincinnati area. And they saw very good retention in those streams. I suspect the impervious surface cover in those watersheds was less. And so the rate of rise and fall in these in that channel is likely to be less impactful than here. So I think we were hoping that it was going to be a little bit more of the wood will generally stay, and it ended up being, if there's something good to retain it, it will. But if you get a flow event that really basically gets high enough that the wood floats, then the log jams tend to break up. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it actually made me think about another question. And if anybody else has some, I'll try to make this quick and feel free to jump in. But I've heard of like the SWCDs getting some grants to remove log jams because of flooding issues. And I just feel like a little bit conflicted about that, because we know that, as your research has shown, the woody debris is good for streams. Could you talk about that? Just kind of like the pros and cons and what your expert opinion is with that type of, issue?
Yeah, that's sort of very interesting. Again, a social, political, dynamic issue that we know 100% that wood is critical in streams for the ecology of these systems. Organisms use it. It creates important characteristics. But that's then as far as ecology can take it, right? Like, we can say it's important for the ecology of the stream to have wood be present. But is flooding a major issue, and is wood the sort of major issue associated with that flooding? As you pointed out, people are getting funding to directly remove wood, and actually a former colleague here at UC who does a lot of work downstream in Mill Creek, they often are removing wood from Mill Creek, actually not so much for flooding, but as potential recreational problems for canoeists who don't want to get caught on a log as they're floating down the Mill Creek. So I think context is very important. And in these headwater streams, I think it's where we sort of need both flow mitigation. So what can we do to keep water from coming off the landscape so fast? Like, wood can only do so much in helping habitat. But if we don't change the way the flows work, and that's, again, a very heavy lift, it's very difficult. Like, impervious surface cover most of our watersheds. Like, where does that water go? How are you going to retain it and keep it from moving down the watershed so quickly? That's a major challenge. But so my professional opinion is sort of, we know it's critical for the ecology. It seems like put it back in and you can see responses from a geomorphology perspective. Can we make it stable? And stability is going to be both dictated by helping modify the hydrology in the watershed, but also making it be more stable. And so how do you then balance that with, again, reasonable concerns of flooding, and particularly local concerns, like a landowner who maybe doesn't want, a bunch of wood causing the stream to change its channel and move in and erode a piece of their property.
Great, thank you so much.
So I think we still have a couple more minutes if there are some other questions out there for Mike.
Hi, Mike. Great presentation. I am curious if there were any like follow-up or anything resulting from the point source flows from that industrial complex, if like there were any conversations with them about I don't know, scheduling release or anything like that.
So we didn't know it existed until a year after. We didn't know why the flows were occurring until about a year after we finished up the fish movement study, and the fish movement study ended because the fish all died. To be clear, the industrial sewer shed does not appear to be like a major component of pollution, and certainly those discharges are not don't appear to be a major pollution issue as far as I know. It was really just this unexpected hydrology that we weren't monitoring and only saw because we happened to be on site a couple of times. They do have they are permitted and they do record when all of their releases occur, and we were able to get through the public health department the record of when all of those flows were released. And actually each of these red dots on this graph is a period where they had a recorded water release and the duration of those water releases. So
Gotcha.
mostly it was just a complexity to interpreting our fish movement data. That really was the big challenge of those discharges.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
Okay, so that pretty much wraps it up. Let's thank Mike again for such an interesting talk. Oh.
Stop sharing.
And let's see, is Sarah still on? Sarah, do you know when the next one of these is and who might be sponsoring that?
We do have a webinar scheduled for mid-January. That is a Watershed Professionals Association webinar, and more information about that is on our website. It's kind of the second billing under upcoming events, but will become top billing after today's notice disappears. That webinar is entitled Contributing to a National Effort, Mapping Aquatic Organism Passage Barriers, and it continues. Sorry about that. Mapping aquatic organism passage barriers at road stream crossings, featuring Kat, I'm going to go ahead and say Henke, with Southeast Aquatics Resources Partnership. So check out the WAMO website for more on that. And thank you, Michael, so much for your presentation today.
No problem.
All right, so everybody have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
You too. Thanks so much.